Welcome to the show. This is the Magician and the Fool podcast, and we are on episode number 45. My name is Dominic, and my fellow co-host's name is Janice. You will hear from him after this intro. In today's episode, we talk to artist, author, teacher, and returning guest, Mr. Nikolas Schreck. It's always such a pleasure to have Nikolas on the show, as he is full of unique and pertinent insight. This being our Halloween episode, we will be discussing the liminality of the season and the liminality of mortality. I highly recommend you go back and listen to Nikolas's previous appearances on the show, episode number 33 and episode number 21. Before we start our conversation, there will be a song of Nikolas's called Calling You From Afar, and then we will jump into our topics. Before we get started, I just want to say that we do touch on a lot of Buddhist ideas. Nikolas is a practicing Buddhist, and so for anyone who is interested in Buddhism and doesn't know where to start, as there are many, many resources and a plethora of books, it can be a little bit overwhelming. I would recommend a book called The Heart of the Buddhist Teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh. It's one that I've had for at least 20 years, and I recommend to anyone who's interested in the topic. It covers all the basics and will give you a nice foundation, starting with the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, as well as the Three Dharma Seals, the Three Jewels, the Four Immeasurable Minds, the Six Paramitas. As you can see, Buddhism loves its lists. I just want to say thank you, as always, to our Patreon supporters. You really do keep the lights on here, so we appreciate it immensely. If you'd like to be a supporter, just head over to Patreon and sign up. We also thank everyone who has given us ratings and reviews on all the different platforms, whether it's YouTube or iTunes or whatnot. That is also greatly appreciated. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius, and may the merits we accumulate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings, so that they, together with us, may equally realize awakening.
I'm calling you from afar. and you will know I'm calling you from afar. Oh, I'm calling you from afar. If your Ouija board says yeah or we, then you know you heard from me. I'm calling you from afar. Yes, I'm calling you from afar. Candles in your parlor flicker, your poor heart beats ever quicker. When wind whispers on your shutters, when your foyer curtains flutter, that rapping at your table isn't Carbo or Clark Gable. I'm calling you from afar. Oh, I'm calling you from afar. I'm calling you from afar. Although I'm in the great beyond, I remain forever fond of you, my dear. Listen and you soft shall hear. I'm calling you from afar. When on your piano plays a tune that only we know, it's not Rudy Valentino, a familiar football topping. On the spiral stairs, although nobody's there, it's me calling you from afar. Though I'm not there in flesh and blood, all that never dies is love. I'm calling you from afar. Yes, I'm calling you from afar. If sleep brings secret spasms, something stains your silken sheets. Dear, that isn't ectoplasm. The dreams we still can reach. When I'm calling you from afar. When I'm calling you from afar. When I'm calling you from afar. Calling you from
Okay, we are extremely pleased, excited, and honored to have former guest of the show, Nikolas Schreck, back on. Can't believe it's been 3 years since we have been getting together for our Halloween episodes. We appreciate it very much. Welcome back to the show, Nikolas.
Yeah, welcome.
My pleasure to be your Halloween spook again. And what's most amazing about the 3 years is the bizarreness of 2 of those years being during this plague era, and how metaphysically strange that has been. So that's why it seems like more or less time has happened since then. In some way, it seems like a century. In another way, like a week. But the pandemic is certainly, at least here in Germany, where I know in America, half of you don't have a pandemic because it's a hoax. But here, here it happened, and we had a very strict lockdown. So it definitely shifted the awareness of time.
Yeah, absolutely. If we would have talked about last year that we would still be going through this, I would have found it hard to believe, but here we are.
Oh, yeah. I know that at that time I thought, we're probably we're drifting out of it now. But
it seems as though we've slid into a alternate reality timeline, a dystopian, the foreword to a dystopian sci-fi novel by Philip K. Dick that was never published.
Absolutely. Yeah. J.G. Ballard and Philip K. Dick got together in the afterworld and wrote this novel that we're in.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, I look all around and I see more and more of these things, and I'm thinking, well, does it all have to be quite so prophetic?
Yep. Well, this is the future everyone said to watch out for, and nobody took it seriously. But in either case, this is the Halloween episode, so we had discussed that we shall talk about what after all is central to Halloween is death. What was the ancient Celtic tradition was to leave. I mean, actually, to put it in a spiritual context, to leave. I mean, the secular Western capitalist tradition of buying candy to give out to creatures that look like creatures of the night and ghosts. And the dead, revenants of the dead, the living dead, that was basically what happened with the ancient Celtic Halloween, but it was completely different because you wore a mask because there was fear of the dead coming for you, and you wanted to be disguised. So the mask was not a joyful costume party. It was to hide your identity from the dead, and you were bribing them with the treats that you left for them. And that's not really, because Western people don't really have much of a spiritual tradition anymore. Of course, in any metaphysical system where you're dealing with discarnate entities, you leave offerings for them. So basically, this was on the night in which the veil between the living and the dead was supposedly the thinnest, and spectral beings came into this world. Human beings, mortal beings, were hiding themselves behind a mask so they would not be taken, and bribing these spiritual beings with treats. And that's where we've inherited our holiday of Halloween. But the useful thing about Halloween in an initiatory sense is that while any serious initiate should be thinking about death and mortality, this at least reminds secular people who may have no spiritual awareness of spiritual metaphysical matters, even if it's in the most frivolous, pop culture manner. At least it brings it to mind. And central to it all, really, and that's why the Day of the Dead is the day after Halloween, it's a moment to take death seriously. And before we begin, I just wanted to ask your listeners to put this in the right context, to imagine for the moment their death. Imagine the moment of death before we begin discussing it, and thinking of the finality of losing everything. Everything you've done, everything you own, everything you are, your physical body, all the people you know, the people you love, the people you hate, and even the experience of this particular world that we're in, which is, as I will explain, just a temporary illusion that has been created by the coming together of certain causes and conditions. So rather than just looking at this like, well, here's this nutty guy talking about some theory, experience and think about your own death, and what does it make you feel? How do you feel about your own death? How do you feel about not being here? So I think to take a moment to do that is important, to understand this is not just an entertainment. This is a real experience, and it's the key experience that any initiate of any tradition should be thinking about.
Very well said. Nikolas, something that just popped into my mind. Do you feel that even sometimes the people that seem to take this holiday seriously don't even consider those very important things? I know that in the occult world, the dead and the spirits are a big part of practice and life, but thinking about those things that you were saying, the attachments specifically, those are kind of paramount, I think, to when we're talking about death, because those are the things that are going to really affect the outcome.
Yeah, well, I think there's a certain level in Halloween of probably the majority of people who celebrate it, and this is something I've noticed about aficionados of horror and the macabre and of Gothic culture. There's a certain amount of them that are actually frightened of the genuine supernatural.
Right.
And I've never felt that way, and I actually feel quite alienated from people in that field very often, because of course have always been attracted to it and took it for absolutely real. But there's a certain amount of people attracted to the macabre and the Gothic, whatever words you want to use for this phenomenon, and who are using it to assuage their fear of it by saying it doesn't really exist. It's just fun and games. It's just dress up. It's just costume. And very often people who are involved in the horror field are the first people to be atheists or to say there's no such thing as supernatural beings or life after death, or the very things that they write about. And I think, yeah, there's in Halloween and in the whole phenomenon of people using fear for pop cultural entertainment, there's certainly a degree of defense mechanism of making light of it so that they don't have to face their genuine dread and terror of the unknown about death. That Halloween, to a certain extent, for people even who are totally obsessed with it, they're using it to nullify or numb their fear by turning it into something celebratory and joyful, but they wouldn't want to go to a morgue and look at real dead people. Of course, there are other people who are, pathologically sick, who are only interested in the physical corpses and that kind of thing, which borders on necrophilia. You have that extreme too. But on a metaphysical level, for a genuine spiritual practitioner, death should be the first thing you should be thinking about, because and I think that the first subject we should ponder, as I said at the beginning, to consider your own death, your real physical death, not just in some romantic, theoretical, philosophical way, but your, the ebbing of your vital force and your death, and your burial, your cremation, and your general and gradual being forgotten by the people you know, becoming a memory, and ultimately the traces of your life being gone, which will happen to all of us one way or the other, no matter what we've accomplished or what we've done or what our ego thinks is important. There will be a total nullification of what our physical being did in this very temporary world. And then also, to set the stage for that, the very universe that we're in is dying at this very moment. As astronomers and physicists know, the universe is pulling apart. The Big Bang that created it is, slowly the universe is pulling apart. Eventually our own sun will not exist. It will become a supernova and a black hole, and the conditions, the very fragile, tentative, tenuous conditions that allowed life to form on this planet will end, and within, from the Diva Loka level, from the cosmic level, the whole existence of the Milky Way, the solar system, the universe, all of it is just a second, less than a second. So above and beyond our physical death of our body, think of the death of the entire universe, the world system, to use the Tantric Buddhist phrase for it, that we live in. But the important thing to keep in mind, even when your physical body is gone, and when the sun is gone, and when this universe is gone, and the planet is dead, and their mind will continue. And this is the most important and essential aspect of this that I want to reinforce on your listeners. Consciousness itself never dies. So to a certain extent, there is no such thing as death. There is the death of physical form and matter, but consciousness never began and will never end. And that's very important then to understanding what should we do with this dreamlike existence that we have, to use the Heidegger phrase, been thrown into this universe without asking to. We have come into this mortal realm of being, which is called the desire realm in the Vajrayana system, because human beings are always longing and yearning and desiring for something to fill the sense of dissatisfaction that is endemic to samsara. So, that's the most important thing to understand. To a certain extent, the word death is a misnomer, because consciousness always exists. So from that, we can kind of segue into this concept of the Bardos, if you want to, unless other questions arise.
I have a couple of thoughts here just to contribute a little bit. This is what you're describing is it's so poignant and important, and it used to be more consistently part of culture. I mean, memento mori was a huge part of European culture, for instance, for a very long time. I think it was amplified during the Black Death period and then became integrated to such a degree where the hooded figure of the Grim Reaper became sort of ubiquitous. But now we have this obsession with youth culture and this idea of the eternity of the image, of the eternity of the flesh, that seems to also be propagated by the media, by Hollywood. And it takes people further out of exactly that very essential point you're making, which is the impermanence.
Well, everything about hyper-capitalism and consumer culture is about selling. Well, there's this phrase, impossible way of being, is a translation from a Sanskrit phrase. Consumerism, Hollywood, advertising, the American way that has infected, the entire Western and Eastern world, for that matter, is all about creating an ideal, permanent youthfulness, never aging, never declining. Every product is better, new and improved. Nothing is impermanent. It's achieving a phony concept of permanent perfection that cannot exist, and that's what's constantly being sold. And then on the level of where we are in the Kali Yuga, the internet and social media, of people presenting idealized, perfected, filtered versions of themselves that have almost, where the avatar of themselves has become more real than the person who is projecting that avatar. That is like a mass dementia and lunacy that is bringing people even further away from the concept of impermanence.
And don't you think it's almost insidious how the term avatar is being used in this context for something that's actually taking people further into the illusion, whereas a true avatar is the opposite of that, and it leads them to liberation.
Yes, I've thought of that it's almost blasphemy that, I mean, Avatar in the Eastern traditions and in Tantric traditions, and I literally, I mean, for instance, the Buddha in the Vedic and Hindu traditions is actually considered the avatar of Vishnu, or, you know, an ordinary person could be the avatar of Kali. And now, yeah, it's been like everything, but this is the nature of the Kali Yuga, to degrade transcendent, metaphysical, spiritual concepts into almost the complete opposite of them. So a phony avatar on the internet, as you say, it couldn't be more of a total dichotomy from being the physical incarnation of a deity, which is what an avatar actually is. But that is the upside down world of the Kali Yuga that we live in, where almost everything is the opposite of what it should actually be. But that's a salient point.
And then even there, then radical inversion actually becomes an act that is positive, an act of grace, because we're turning against the tide of this downward spiral.
Well, that is necessary for the warrior initiate in the Kali Yuga to be against. I mean, to a certain extent, you have to accept this world system is in decline. And maybe before we get into the physical death and what happens to the human body and the mind of a mortal being, we have to understand the larger context of what we're in. Just like winter will come, now we're in fall, but winter will come, the Kali Yuga is part of a cycle. There has been a golden age, which there is no trace of it within the Kali Yuga because it's gone. But when the Kali Yuga ends, many, many, many thousands of years from now, a new golden age will begin, and then it will decline again, and then the Kali Yuga will come again. So it's not like the Christian apocalypse or the Odinic Ragnarok that happens once. The world doesn't end once, it ends over and over again, exactly as we do, exactly as everybody listening to this, every human being, every flea, every frog, every dog, every cat listening to this. We have all gone through the process of birth and death beyond comprehension, number of billions of times for billions of years, beyond even the capacity of the human mind to absorb how long that's been happening. So, yeah, so even though we're in a period of decline, the decline will eventually become a period of transcendence, but that's ultimately futile. That's why it's samsara. It goes nowhere. It will keep revolving and revolving and revolving around, and we physical beings will keep, unless we understand the essence of mind and understand how to become enlightened and liberated, which are not just lofty words, but an actual process that can occur through training of the mind and spiritual practice, we will keep returning to this universe in different forms, in different levels, different worlds, different aeons, different completely unimaginable forms that human beings are not even aware of. We will keep returning to this cycle of samsara, of suffering, which means we will be born, we will get old, we will get sick, and we will die, which are the four things that the Buddha said are characteristic of the six realms of being. Now, most people fear death and think that it's a good thing to come into this world. To a certain extent, it is, and this is called the noble human birth. We are lucky to a certain extent and have a measure of very good karma to come into this realm of being. We could have been born in the hell realms. We could have been born as a hungry ghost. We could have been born as an animal. And I'll explain too, even the higher realms are not ideal to be born into, of the demigods, the gods, and the transcendent bodiless realm above that. In the human realm, we have, It is the only place where we have the capacity to have enough suffering and enough pleasure to have time to contemplate the meaning of our existence and to train our mind. It is in the hell realm you have complete suffering all the time. In the God realm, it's like people who are born into immense wealth never have any challenge. They have everything they need, so they don't have to try to develop themselves. You make that metaphor. Here in the human realm, we have an element of suffering and dissatisfaction, but we also have the leisure time, some of us, to contemplate metaphysics and the meaning of life, and how to understand consciousness in the mind. In all the other realms, we can't do that. So, as a general introduction to the context and situation that we're in, but then unless you have any other thoughts on that, we could get into the Bardos themselves and maybe concentrate on the process of death that's appropriate to Halloween.
I think this is the perfect segue to that point. So let's talk about the Bardos, and let's start maybe simply with just a definition of what the term means for our listeners who are unfamiliar with Buddhism and Eastern thought.
Right. And in the context of this discussion we're having, I'm going to try to avoid Sanskrit and Tibetan phrases which tend to exoticize or romanticize or at least aestheticize things that are very clear and easy to understand if you put them in simple lay language. So the Bardo basically means a time between two things, and a more graceful way of translating it could be a threshold or a liminal experience. It's a gateway between one process of being and the other, and you can define them as 6 or 4, and then there's even sub levels, but I'm going to try to keep it streamlined and simple. Now, I think kind of like this is a problem that Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky have created with her misunderstanding and simplification of Eastern terms, which sort of infected all of occultism and New Age and metaphysical thought and Western mysticism. Kind of like when people think of karma, automatically don't you think of negative karma? People usually say, like on the most simple, vulgar level, something bad happens to someone you don't like, and you say, well, that's karma. But very rarely do people think of positive karma, that you accrue positive karma. People think of karma as a punishment. And my general feeling in talking to people about this often is that when you say Bardo, they think it only means death. I think maybe they even think it's a synonym for the afterlife state. Wouldn't you say?
Yes.
That seems to be the general. So the important thing to understand is what we are in right now is a Bardo. It is the Bardo of living, and this Bardo of living is an afterlife state. That's maybe the first thing to contemplate. We are now experiencing the afterlife of who we used to be before us. The person who died, who we then were reborn from that mind, like the flame of a candle going out but being moved to another candle, that used to be us. So we are, this Bardo of living is in fact the afterlife of the last being we were. And like an accordion that stretches back 1 billion years or beyond, we are just one in a long succession of beings, not even all human, who have continued to take form and incarnate into the various 6 worlds of being. So I think people tend to think the Bardo is the death realm, and here we are in something like the normal, ordinary, regular realm. But that shows you the extent of our illusion and our hallucination that we're in from our ignorance, literal ignorance of the way reality is. This Bardo is is this is the afterlife that people will say, I don't believe in an afterlife, but we are now living somebody else's afterlife. And another way to look at that, when people have a new child, an infant or a baby, they look at it as a tabula rasa, like, oh, look at this wonderful, innocent new being. But it's important in a very real sense to understand that a newborn baby is somebody or some being who died 49 days earlier, for the most part. There are exceptions and anomalies, but for the most part, 49 days before that baby was born, or before they were conceived, rather, not the 9 months. Before they were conceived, they were somebody who died. So every newborn baby you're looking at is looking around confused and screaming and crying for the most part, though some have the karma not to do that. That's a reanimated corpse, is a certain way that you could look at that. It's somebody who recently died, and in their infant mind, they are closer to the person they were than the person they're going to become. For a very brief time, they will even have memories to a certain extent of that person who died, or at least the physical body died. The consciousness is obviously returned in a new form.
And there have been case studies on this too, where children who have these memories are interviewed by scientists, by psychologists, sociologists. They follow up on the information, and they end up finding that the person that the child is describing had an actual discrete existence and was an identifiable personality that had no connection often to their current family and the child. There's no way the child even could have known any of this information.
The could be in another historical period, another language. And of course, in the West, people try to come up with a scientific explanation for that. In the Tantric tradition and the Pan-Indian tradition of all the various spiritual systems in the Indian world, and the Tibetan world, where the Indian traditions transmigrated, that's completely normal to be able to identify who somebody was. I mean, even lay people, the tradition of knowing, and very often people do reincarnate back into their families again and again in different forms. So the father dies and could come back as the daughter of the child of the father. Or you could come back as a family pet, depending on your karma. So for the most part, people do tend to reincarnate into a constellation of people they've already known. But yes, it can be completely unpredictable and from another planet, another culture, another dimension.
I just wanted to say I also think it's useful, even though this is coming more from a Western esoteric perspective. 49 is an interesting number because 7 is the number of Saturn, the Lord of Karma. And 49 is 7 multiplied by itself. So this is a process of 7 karmic cycles in the afterworld. And as far as I understand it, time in itself is experienced very differently when one is discarnate.
Oh, completely. I mean, that's an important point. I mean, I do want to get into the specifics of these various Bardos soon, so we don't lose track of that. But yes, time is completely contingent on having a physical body that we know is dying. Time and death are actually completely married together. When our consciousness leaves our physical body, time is something completely other. Time only has meaning and context within a mortal body that's going to die. When the spirit and consciousness are free of matter, what is time exactly? So even when we say 49 days, it's kind of like saying 49 days according to earthly mortal standards. When your consciousness experiences that time frame, it doesn't feel like that. You're right, it's completely different. And I mean, and we can experience that. Now, another bardo state like this, the important thing to understand, this bardo state that we're in now, that we call life, is just a state of consciousness. It is not an actual reality. It feels like a reality, and that's why it is so tricky, and why it's such a tempting illusion to keep coming back into. But it is only a different level. One way you could look at it, it's like a dream. It isn't exactly a dream. And then another bardo state is the bardo of dreaming. And the bardo of dreaming is a little bit moving towards the bardo of death. When we sleep and dream, for instance, if you can remember a dream that you had recently, if either of you can describe one, what were you doing in that dream?
Well, I had an interesting dream the other night, actually, that kind of ties into what we're talking about. I had a dream of my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandmother has recently died within the year, and I had a dream that they were together, and we were actually incinerating my grandfather's body. This sounds weird, maybe, but it was like they were saying goodbye, like he was moving on from whatever place he was at, even though he had already been passed on for quite a while. She was kind of newly passed on, and we were at sort of a funeral for him where the body was being incinerated and they were saying goodbye. I was just an observer, but it was definitely interesting in the context of what we're talking about.
Yeah, that totally appropriate and ties into this. So the body that you were watching that happen, that, you know, when you're in that dream, watching your grandfather be incinerated or being with your recently deceased grandmother, it feels totally real to you.
Correct.
When you're in the dream. Unless you're in a lucid dream, and unless you've trained your mind to recognize the dream bardo, when you're in that dream, you are 100%, you are that body. Now here where we are, we also have the very strong illusion that this body that we have is us. Now, the dream bardo body, that is a form of the death body. That, and if you can imagine that, when our spirit leaves our physical body and we begin this 49-day wandering in the bardo of it's literally called the painful bardo of death. That's the formal name for it. We will have a body that is like that dream body. It's not real, it's not physical, but we will, through our attachment to this form, we will see ourselves as we were at the height of our health and vibrancy. So if someone dies when they're 90 years old and their spirit leaves their body, they will look at when their spirit leaves and is in the bardo of death, they will not see their 90-year-old withered, weak body. They will see themselves at whatever the height of their vibrancy was.
That's interesting. That was actually the case in this dream as well. My grandparents were their younger selves in the dream when they were together. And it's interesting for me, my experience with these kind of dreams is that life and death aren't the same. Like I can meet someone who has died in the dream, and it's almost like you forget that they died, that death is irrelevant.
Well, they didn't, to a certain extent. I mean, there, as I said, there's no such thing as death. And that kind of ties into, I think it's important because a lot of Westerners, and even strangely secular Westerners, have it. Like one funny phenomenon I noticed, probably because I'm a musician, whenever a musician dies, completely atheistic secular people who never think about it, the afterworld or the spiritual consciousness, like some rock and roll person ODs, and no matter how miserable a life they had and how tragic and how decadent and whatever negative karma they had, they imagine them going to some gigantic jam session with Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain and Brian Jones and Janis Joplin and these other drug addicts and drunks, as if those beings would go to some heavenly realm of consciousness and would still be themselves. That Elvis would still be Elvis it's almost a folk religion.
Absolutely. And I don't want to segue too far into this, but I have so many thoughts. I mean, this fetishization of these figures by that wave of the boomer generation is, I mean, it's abhorrent to me, to be honest with you. It's become so banal and so hypersaturated in Western culture, this constant attempt to grasp and hold on to with the death grip the fleeting apparition of a brief period in their youth, which is kind of connecting right back to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it isn't really a digression. I think that's actually what is the real, if you really measured what does the average person in the Western world ever think about death? It's when some celebrity that meant something to them in their youth died. It scares them because it reminds them of their mortality. And then they idealize and romanticize the very often sordid or frankly stupid deaths of these, Jim Morrison, ODing in a bathroom and then being hidden and sneaked out of a nightclub and put in a bathtub. And then they glamorize that, or, you could use a billion other situations, Amy Winehouse and it goes on and on. James Dean, Marilyn Monroe. This is a cult of death that is very much a part of like folk culture. And I think it's because people have lost the gods or lost any spiritual beings that they use as role models, then these neurotic celebrities become quasi-gods that they worship because they died young. Marilyn, James Dean, Elvis, etc., this pantheon. But who were these people? Were, extremely tortured, fucked up people, not people to idealize, people who died in horrible ways, usually from their own ignorance or drug addiction. So,
right.
and then so we make them into immortal heroes, and that, that's definitely a samsaric, upside down, wrong, Kali Yugic way to look at death.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about fear earlier, because it is kind of this artificial immortality created by this capitalistic machine, because we're always running from that fear of death. And so to kind of immortalize these figures is kind of putting a Band-Aid on the whole thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And that ties in again to the everyone turning themselves into, Andy Warhol's prophecy has come true in the most hideous, nightmarish way of everybody having their little platform of being a quasi-celebrity as an avatar and trying to create some artificial doppelganger that is perfect, that will be immortalized, like this pantheon of secular gods.
Society of the spectacle.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, to get more directly to what will happen, so we are in this state of consciousness that we consider to be living, but really think about it, and this is still the echo of somebody else's death. We are, somebody who we used to be wondered what will happen when I die. Well, this that we're experiencing is who we used to be. This is it. This is their afterlife. Now, maybe we need to get to how do we get born before we can discuss how do we die. When we are wandering, the last person we were when we died wandered in this threshold state called the bardo of the painful bardo of death, and unless they were a spiritually realized person who had been meditating and who had been taught by an experienced teacher what is the essence of mind and how to recognize the mind, and this cliche that may be the only thing people may know about Tantric Buddhism, to go towards the white light, to the clear light, which is consciousness. That is actual, what is called the dharmata. That is reality as it is, without any obscuration or any elaboration. if you haven't been trained to do that, and if you haven't spent your time on this earth training yourself to be ready for that moment of death, which is a wholly positive and good thing. There's nothing wrong with the consciousness leaving the body if we understand what to do at that moment, which we can learn to do, and that is the process of initiation. But if we have never learned to do that, as most people squander their very brief time on this earth only with worldly distractions. You couldn't even call them worldly pleasures, because a lot of them aren't, pleasurable. But totally taking this sensory phenomena that this physical world gives us as real, and never ever thinking about the inner metaphysical, spiritual, or transcendent, then when death comes, it will be extremely frightening, because they will realize they never were that person that they thought they were. And it will be like waking up from a nightmare or a dream and seeing that this whole life that we had, it's just as fragile and temporary as a soap bubble dissolving. But then consciousness will remain, and they will still have, like in a dream, this dream body, this subtle body. They will look down and see their recognizable body as they were at the height of their strength, and they will not realize they're dead for a while. And I did touch upon this a little last Halloween, but it's probably important to mention again that there are ways to know that you are dead, and it's there could be people listening to this, and you need to be aware of this, that death can come at any moment. So somebody listening to this is going to die soon, and needs to know that when your spirit leaves your body, unless you're trained to recognize the signs, you'll be confused, and you'll look at your family or your friends or your wife or husband or your pet or whoever, whatever your familiar situation your recently deceased body was in, they will be like on a Twilight Zone episode. You will be trying to talk to them or communicate with them, and they will not be able to hear you because you don't realize you're dead yet. That's one of the first things that happens when you go through a process of death, which I haven't gone into yet. But when you reach that state of having this threshold bardo body that looks like your younger, more vibrant self, or wherever you were at the peak of your life, you will try to communicate with your loved ones, or even if not your loved ones, if you're die in a hospital or around strangers, you'll try to tell the nurses, you're here, what are you doing? But you don't realize you're dead unless you've already been trained to recognize it. So that's very important to keep in mind.
I think that's a very compassionate thing for you to bring up to our listeners. And the Tibetan way is very beautiful in that they have a very specific protocol for after someone dies, and they are doing that very compassionate thing where they are sitting with the body for multiple days and saying, hey, by the way, you're dead, remember? And here's what you need to do.
I have to point out that is a great deal of my work as a spiritual teacher. And actually during the pandemic, or actually when the pandemic began, never to do with COVID deaths, strangely, but with many others, there have been, I've had to do that many times, and dealing with illness and death and the gradual passing of the life force is a big part of what I do. So I've had to be in many hospitals and funerals and dealing with corpses and telling them that they're dead. And not so long ago, I think, in the last decade, there was this is very appropriate to Halloween, but it's not spooky in a fun way, and that's important too to understand. There was a experience, which I'm not going to go into great detail about, where I had a dream many years earlier of someone I knew very well, that a relative of theirs died. And it was a poetic, metaphoric dream, but I knew, and I hadn't seen this person, but I had the dream, okay, their relative died. And then many years after the dream, I happened to write it down, and that person and I were in contact, and I communicated this dream, and the dream happened around the time that this relative of theirs died. Upon my telling them about the dream, the ghost of that person materialized here in Germany with me, with someone else I know, and materialized in America with the person whose relative it was.
Wow.
And it was malevolent and frightened, the feeling of this spirit, and it was visible, very visible and recognizable. And I went to the grave of that person in America when I happened to have to go to America for business, and actually did the Tibetan rite to tell that person that they're dead. And after I did that, this ghost phenomenon ceased. And strangely, and this is a weird karmic thing, we didn't really like each other in life, but I ended up being the person who had to inform him that he's dead. So I want to put that in a very real context, that this is not just theoretical. That's why you need to know these things and to understand the nature of death. And, in Halloween, where people are innocently conjuring spirits, I mean, not to try to sound like an evangelical Christian, but by opening the door, by even putting on a devil costume, most people don't know what they're doing when they do that. They are attracting demonic and infernal forces that are very real. So if you're, for this one day on Halloween, you've got many millions of people in the West becoming the living dead or vampires or werewolves or Frankenstein's monster or some of the more modern horror figures. We are conjuring up the dead, and we are calling spirits, even if they wouldn't have come anyway because of this celestial rift that occurs on this date. You're calling spiritual beings into play. So I just wanted to give that example. That's very real.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah. Now, one other thing I'll mention, like even today, people think demons, ghosts are kind of quaint and funny and romantic and gothic. Even today, I talked to somebody who had an incubus experience in America, and they were frightened by it, or at least alarmed by it. And they were wondering, am I going crazy? Is this really happening? And then they were staying in a hotel. This just happened a few hours ago. Again, not theoretical, real. These things are happening all the time for people that are sensitive to them. And they were staying in a hotel, and they heard somebody outside talking to someone they knew who was complaining that some spiritual force or ghost was touching them in their sleep in the next room in this hotel. So, these things are happening. And, that's what in Halloween, in a kitschy way to deal with our fear about it, people are using costumes to try to come to terms with these spiritual forces, which are almost never paid attention to anymore in the Western world, except through these, ridiculous psychic phenomena, ghost hunting type shows, which is garbage and actually very, very, very misleading. But
Yeah,
so
trash.
I wanted to give two examples of, this is real. Ghosts are real, but there's nothing fun or romantic about them. They are literally human beings who don't realize that they should be in the other bardo. They are still clinging so much to their physical body and to this life, usually because they died violently or prematurely. They don't know they're dead. And so it's important for us in the mortal world, like you said, in the Tibetan tradition, the compassionate thing to do is to not to lead a ghost on, though that might sound funny, but to tell them, you're dead, right? You need to leave. You need to go. So, just as I said, somebody who's listening to this, everyone should be aware of, some people hearing this today will be dead tomorrow. Something will happen to somebody. somebody is going to encounter a supernatural force of some kind. So you should be aware. Ghosts should be told, you're dead. You should leave. You don't need to be here anymore. Even if you're not trained to do it, you can have a compassionate conversation with a spirit that is trapped between the Bardos.
And I want to just jump in before we wade into the waters even more deeply here and mention that, to my understanding and experience too, the souls that sometimes, either the ones that don't know or the ones that do know and refuse to let go of the material life, they turn into what in some circles are called astral zombies. They start decomposing on the plane that's very close to the material plane.
Absolutely.
It's really bad for them because their minds also start to go too.
Sure. Absolutely. That's why it's necessary, and why ancient cultures, traditional cultures rooted in some sort of spiritual legacy, know to do the proper rites to send. Actually on Halloween, vampires. What are vampires? They exist. They're not elegant aristocrats floating around a castle. They are malevolent ghosts or supernatural beings that, in some cases, like in India, it's a very common tradition. There are spiritual forces that fool people and trick them into thinking that they're gods, and because India believes in spiritual things in a way that the Western world doesn't, or at least some people there do, it's becoming rapidly westernized as well. These beings need blood and they need meat, and they will inhabit the body of somebody who died recently and reanimate it. There's nothing glamorous or romantic or gothic about that. So, a vampire is a real thing. It's a being, a supernatural being that feeds on blood and death and meat. And actually, even there is a tradition. For instance, there's a very good book I can recommend that gets into this called The Food of the Bodhisattvas, which is a Buddhist text which talks about eating meat and, ingesting the dead meat and blood of animals attracts these vampiric spirits to suck your energy out of you, and leads to all kinds of Ayurvedic contextual illnesses that come from spiritual beings, like spiritual mosquitoes drawing your blood and your life essence from you and creating illnesses.
Well, and Nikolas, another thing I've learned that I think you probably know a lot about is when black magicians or sorcerers realize that the end of their incarnation is near, and I mean genuine ones, not the play actors that we see on the internet. They often will not be willing to let go of being attached to this realm and its pleasures, and so they become an especially insidious kind of vampire because they have certain mastery of an esoteric skill.
Absolutely. You could refer to something like that. That is like a black bodhisattva, if you want to use that phrase. If you understand how the mind works, but you abuse it to perpetuate the ego rather than to dissolve the ego, and rather than developing universal compassion and understanding of emptiness, you grasp on to the ego with ferocity. Yes, a genuine black magician, if you want to use that phrase, could perpetuate their life and become that kind of vampiric being. And I have experience with that. I know that that's true. It's not just a fairy tale. That's not just supernatural fiction. That is actually possible, and it happens. But that shows the depth of ignorance to do that, to hold on to this particular physical form. But that kind of being can become worshipped, like I said, by simple people could see that as a god when it's a false god. And then that gets into an even deeper, huger question. Who is this being that the Abrahamic religions call God? He is actually a being like that. As you know, the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, is a false god, and is a vampiric god that lives off of blood and war and destruction, and everything that the Old Testament recommends. So that's one way to look at it. Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah is that kind of false god on a very huge level, but that can happen with a local spirit as well. So that is what happens when a black magician ego tries to perpetuate itself for eternity.
That's very interesting, and I can almost see someone out there rubbing their hands together with dollar signs in their eyes, thinking about how can I capitalize on this whole black bodhisattva thing that I just learned about. There must be a course I can run on how to connect.
Oh, I'm sure somebody is. I'm almost loath to talk about it too much, because whatever is the worst path is the one that people will be attracted to always. But it does have to. So I mean, what are vampires? They exist. At the moment somebody dies, a malevolent spirit who wants to come into the physical world and enjoy the pleasure. I mean, even gods come into, as every mythology shows you, they want to come into this mortal world and experience physical pleasures that are not exactly the same in the spiritual world. Mm-hmm. So that exists, but there's nothing glamorous or romantic about any of that, about being a ghost.
And just to bring a different counterpoint to it for those people that might be thinking that this might be a good career path for them, there are other good forces that counterbalance this. I mean, in the book The Night Terrors, I believe, there's a description of how among the Slavic countries, at least, there are these basically shamans who would shapeshift, who would become werewolves, and they would actually hunt out beings like this and demons and fight them back into the hell realms. Right. So there are natural. You don't get to just hover around and be like this. There are forces.
No. There are cosmic forces, and I would not say good or evil. But there are forces of compassion, and there are forces of selfishness, and the funny. I mean, I was going to get into that too. So we've talked about what are ghosts really, what are vampires really, and werewolves too. In ancient traditions, are not an entirely demonic or evil being. Very often, the wolf, in many Native American traditions, northern traditions, is not at all seen as a malevolent. The werewolf is like a warrior, almost like a wrathful deity. Not always, but many times the wolf or the werewolf or lycanthrope archetype is a positive one that fights demonic beings. So, yeah, we have to be careful to look at the most ancient traditions of these things.
That's very interesting. And I think you made a good point earlier where people maybe they may think that they are worshiping gods or working with gods when in fact they are working with tortured spirits or what you would call maybe demons. Even the Neoplatonists, the theurgists, talk about if you are in a degenerate state, you can't even know the higher beings because there's no connection. So the gods that you think you are working with are actually very well could be something like a demon.
Well, I can speak from my own ignorance. In my youth, what was as a child, the first thing I was attracted to were the demonic forces, not the positive ones. And there they were. They if you conjure them, they will be there. It's like opening your. It's like they're the criminals of the spiritual world. They're, just like burglars and robbers are waiting to see if your door or window is open to break in. These maras, or malevolent beings, are waiting for foolish mortals to call on them so that they can come stir up trouble in this world. So yeah, and now another important point that reminds me of is spiritualism, and especially these days, people do a lot of naive communication with ghosts or trying to call on their ancestors or like the modern form of table rapping and spiritualism in the 19th century. A very important point is do not think that somebody who died has some kind of wisdom just because they are in corporeal form. On the contrary, that is, as you said, they could be astrally rotting They could be losing their consciousness by being stuck between the Bardos. So it's a very odd idea that people think just because, Uncle Bob died yesterday, that suddenly he should be your moral guardian from beyond, because he's still Uncle Bob, except he's a confused Uncle Bob in another world who doesn't realize he's dead. So it's very weird, the fetishization of the dead and the assumption that they have a wisdom, that's not who you should be going for spiritual advice. I think that's important to add.
Yeah, and it's almost fashionable nowadays in some circles to work with ghosts and the dead. And there were legitimate sorceress techniques of antiquity where that was the case, but now you have almost soccer moms. Between picking the kids up from school, they're gonna
sure.
call on a demon or the undead at a graveyard to help them with XYZ. What do you think about that sort of modern phenomenon?
Well, obviously it's completely egotistical and selfish, and using spirits in itself is karmically damaging. But the soccer mom or even a well-educated person who thinks they're a great mystic or magician, their ego is blinding them to what they're doing. So as you said about the ancient theurgists, if you're impure, you're going to call upon impure spirits. You will not even notice the beneficial or auspicious ones. So they're playing with fire. But I know from experience, you can warn people about that. They will never, ever, ever believe it. People that want to play with demons and Satan and these things, and even have the arrogance to say, well, they're not real. They're just symbols. They're just archetypes. They are absolutely destroying themselves and playing with fire. But I know there's no point in warning people like that, because the obscurations, the karmic obscurations, prevent them from seeing the harm of what they're doing.
So, Nikolas, in terms of we talked about this world being a bardo, but you've also used the word bardo in the plural. For our listeners, what do the other bardos look like?
Right. Well, there's this one that we're in, the bardo of living. There's the bardo of the meditative state of dhyana or shamatha. There's a state of consciousness that comes from meditation, or you could say of dharma practice. That is a state of consciousness. There is the bardo of dreams, which we all experience. And that is a very good test run for death. Dreaming is very much like a certain aspect of what will happen when the mind is freed from the body, because anything can happen. In the same way, to use the Western phrase, the subconscious becomes manifest when you're dreaming, when your spirit has left your body and is in the painful bardo of death. Whatever you're thinking will be. There's within less than a split second, if you think of something when your spirit's no longer in your body, it's there. And that's why it's very important to control your mind and tame your mind while it is still contained in this physical vessel. Then there's the transcendent luminous bardo that you could say is enlightenment. That's another bardo. And within the 4 or 6 bardos, depending on which system you want to look at, there are many subcategories. For instance, and this is important to note, that in the tantric tradition, the moment of death could become the moment of enlightenment and liberation if you understand how to use it properly. It could be the permanent moment of liberation if you have been trained and meditated properly on it and you waited for it and you knew what to do. But if you cannot become liberated at that moment, there is a tradition called POA, which you can learn while you are in a physical body, and it requires particular empowerments from a master who is qualified to teach this system of POA. You can then, when your consciousness leaves your body, you can do a practice that will send your spirit permanently to what is called the Pure Land. In Japan, most of what Buddhism is this Pure Land or Amitaya Buddhism. But this is one particular practice in the Vajrayana Tantric system, and the Pure Land is a realm of consciousness, or a kind of sub-bardo, in which if you are not fully liberated, you can at least do this practice and go there until you become liberated. And this bardo is created by a particular bodhisattva out of compassion for beings who aren't trained enough to become fully enlightened or liberated. I think very few people have even heard of that. That's another level of consciousness. And there in the so-called Pure Land, which is no more real or less real than this consciousness state that we are in now, you can get the teachings required for as long as it takes to become enlightened or liberated, and you will never fall from that state back into the so-called lower realms of human, animal, demon, ghost.
That's very interesting. And so, as you mentioned earlier, no one ever knows when they will be transitioning. It could be tomorrow, it could be today, it could be 1 week. So practically speaking, most of us are not going to have the good fortune to have someone at their bedside reading, the Tibetan Book of the Dead or whatnot to help them along. What are some practical steps that someone could take now to best prepare themselves for that moment?
Well, not to be frightened of death, to understand that you have already died billions of times, you've already been through this process, there's absolutely nothing to fear, and this may be hard to grasp, but at the moment of death, and for that 49-day period, or what feels like a 49-day period from an earthly perspective, your mind has 9 times the power of what it has on Earth. So you will have what would seem to be psychic abilities of telepathy and all of that comes with the mind working perfectly without all the obscurations that the physical body kind of prevents it and limits it from using. So there's absolutely nothing to fear about death, and you cannot avoid it. There's absolutely nothing, and I know someone out there who's actually, today I talked to them, who's actually terrified of death, and the main lesson for that person and for anybody is there's nothing to fear. And this may be hard to grasp, but at the moment of death you will understand it, because your mind will be operating on a higher level. What is frightening is to keep coming back to this world of birth, old age, sickness, and death again and again. It is not frightening for the consciousness to leave the body. So, and secondarily, I think this is an important thing. It may not be understood by everyone, but if you contemplate it on a deeper level, the spiritual tradition which I am initiated in, the Karmakaju school of Tantric Buddhism, the leader of that sect is the Karmapa. And the 16th Karmapa, who died in 1981, there now is the 17th Karmapa. When he was dying, one of his disciples was crying and upset. He was dying in a hospital in Chicago, and he showed absolutely no pain, though he had cancer. He was laughing, joyful, not fearing death at all. And this disciple was crying, and he said to him the words, "Nothing happens." And that is true here in this world that we're in, and in the next world, and in all the different bardos and worlds. Nothing is actually happening, so there is actually nothing to fear. And I know that will be hard for most people to grasp, but it's important to contemplate and think about that. And that gets into sunyata, or what is translated as emptiness. Nothing is actually happening but consciousness. Everything that you are experiencing, good, bad, or indifferent, however you judge it to be, is your own consciousness reflected back at you. So all that is happening is consciousness. And then if we go deeper, what is consciousness? What is thought? What is mind? Where do you locate it? Where do you find it? It actually doesn't exist. We have a subjective experience of it, but it actually is not existent. So ultimately, there is nothing to fear if you can grasp the subtleties of that.
Interesting. Yeah, it reminded me of the Heart Sutra, what you were saying, and then, of course, you said sunyata, so there was that connection there.
Well, emptiness. The main message of the Heart Sutra, which is the Mahayana tradition, emptiness is form. Form is emptiness. So we perceive, and our senses perceive a physical world, but it is empty. It is not actually existent. Mm-hmm. It's like a shimmering mirage. And this is why the rainbow is a metaphor that's used in Tantric Buddhism. We see the rainbow, we see the vivid colors of it, but can you touch it? You see it, it's there, but like our body in the dream, it's not fully existent either. It's kind of a trick of the mind. And that's what everything we are experiencing is. The entirety of this universe is consciousness. So if nothing is happening, there's nothing to fear.
One thing I want to get into here just for a quick minute is this idea of, look, now is the only thing that's real, to quote somebody who said that once.
Right, Richard Alpert.
Yeah. So
he got it from some guru in India. Yeah.
And we have to really focus in on that point. The thing that scares me about death is not death. Death doesn't scare me. What scares me is not having a beneficial contribution to this realm before I pass from this existence, because the opportunity to be incarnate is such a privilege, and we shouldn't squander it on senselessness.
Yes, well, that gets into karma specifically. Most people will totally squander, what I said before, the precious or noble human birth. To have the good fortune, you must have good karma to be born into this world where it is possible to become enlightened. And there are certain conditions that I won't explain right here because it's too lengthy, that make for a noble human birth or a precious human birth. But to have the good... one metaphor for this that I can think of is that a tantric teaching is that the ability to be born into this world is as rare as a tortoise in the ocean, its shell rising and perfectly rising into a bubble above it that will fit it perfectly. That's a metaphor for how rare it is to be born into this particular world where we have the opportunity to contemplate wisdom and to become enlightened. On the other hand, another tantric teacher has put across the idea that think of this life as could just be a brief vacation from the hell realms. We could have come from there and we could be going right back to the hell realms. And they exist. And they are many. It's not just like the Abrahamic idea of one hell. There are many different kinds of hell dependent on the negative karma you bring into that. So, to answer your question of how not to squander this life, karma and mindfulness of your actions is the key. Every thought, every word, and every action you make has karmic weight. And karma, again, is such a misunderstood word, like bardo. It just means there are absolute consequences to every action, thought, and speech. And you need to watch all of those things carefully, which is why mindfulness and being aware that there is only now is crucial. Full awareness of what are you saying, what are you doing, what are you thinking, and what are the consequences of each action you make. if that is the key to understand. You're going to make your next life based on the decisions you make right now. Every habit you have, every process of thought that you keep pursuing, every action you make, you are creating the next life for yourself. Because of impermanence, we can create a much better, more auspicious rebirth, and could even become liberated or enlightened if we fully understood karma, and if we fully purified and accepted that we are responsible for our next life, that we are not just thrown into it by some random force. We are writing the script of our next life, just as whoever we were before, and before that, and before that, and before that, wrote the script for who we have become now. So karma is the key, taking karma totally 100% seriously.
I couldn't agree more. I find personally that people who are more Western leaning spiritually, they don't like this whole idea of karma because it's an Eastern thing. It's an Eastern idea. That's not part of the Western tradition. Maybe it makes sense, but I'm not incorporating that into my practice because that's not part of what I do.
Oh, I've met people who very arrogantly think if they don't believe in it, it doesn't.
Right.
It's like saying I don't believe in electricity or gravity, therefore it doesn't affect me. But it is as absolutely real and objective an experience as electricity or gravity. So
it also shows their ignorance because this was taught by the most archaic roots of the Western tradition. We know that it was part of the Pythagorean tradition, for instance. It's in esoteric Judaism. I mean, it's there.
Well, you shall reap what you shall sow, So, I mean, that should be understood. It's part of every spiritual tradition, no matter the theological differences. Karma. I mean, but I think even the word just sounds exotic and Eastern to most Westerners, and therefore they reject it as some sort of hippie idea that has nothing to do with reality. It's very simple. If you think something, you are making that happen. If you say it, you're making it even more real. And if you do it, for instance, if you think, I hate so-and-so, you are generating hatred against yourself. If you say out loud, I hate you, you are making it deeper. It's a heavier karma. And then if you kill somebody you hate, you've created an extremely negative karma. And similarly with love, if you genuinely think I love you, and you really do, and it's not just empty words, and you express it and you manifest it, that would create positive karma. If it was true love and not just attachment or exploitation. So that's how we do. That's what we must focus on. Is forget the word karma. If it turns Westerners off because it's too Eastern. Your actions all have consequences. Absolutely everything you say, do, and think has consequences forever. And you can purify your negative karma, but for the most part, we are selfishly accruing worse and worse and worse karma that will give ourselves a worse life. And as the Dalai Lama has said, because human beings are naturally selfish, it's actually, you can use your selfishness to think, I don't want to end up in the hell realm, therefore I will work on purifying my karma. Because most people can't be compassionate and altruistic without knowing what's in it for them.
Right.
We can use that weakness of the human mind against itself.
Yes, that would definitely be expedient means, yes.
Right.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we kind of touched just now on the Western mystery tradition, and I wanted to ask you, I think you would be somebody who is one of the most qualified people right now in the world maybe to talk on this point, but I personally, and this is just my personal understanding, I tend to associate both Set and Osiris with this season, with the season of Scorpio and Halloween, and the god Set, taken out of the vilification that occurred to him, really is a god also of initiation and the mysteries, but some of that process has to do with the direct confrontation with death and the confrontation with terror as a purification. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, briefly, because I think that would lead us into whole other levels. I think one thing to say is that the Egyptian or Kemite understanding of the death process is remarkably similar to the Tantric Vajrayana tradition and this I'll get into how that ties into Set. In the Tantric tradition, and even in the Pan-Indian tradition of much Indian mysticism, there are 5 elements to consciousness called the skandhas. And then at the moment our consciousness leaves our body, these 5 skandhas separate. And actually, people don't realize you are reincarnated 5 times, not just once, but each of these skandhas, unless you are a highly developed tulku who has mastered consciousness completely, these 5 skandhas that came together as you will separate and become other beings. So you're not just reborn into one body, 5 aspects of you are reborn into several different bodies and forms. And then in the Egyptian tradition, there are 7 aspects or pillars of consciousness that separate. People know the Ka and the Kabit probably. You know what I'm talking about. And that's very similar, the process that you go through. And then, just as in the Tantric tradition, you confront Yama, the god of death, who judges you, and with black pebbles and white pebbles, actually, at least metaphorically or symbolically, says, look at how many black pebbles of negative karma, how many white pebbles of positive karma, and judges what you will become. I mean, you've created this reality for yourself. Similarly, the ancient Egyptians understood that Set was the guardian of death, and your next life, or where you would go in the afterworld, would be dependent on a test from this challenger or terrifier, Set. Similarly, Set was a very sexual being, but he did not procreate. He did not have children. Only the child he had was Thoth, who was born in a natural way, and that's wisdom, the god of wisdom. So death and life as the opposite of each other, but also flip sides of the same coin. In ancient Egypt, for primitive birth control, there would be a stone that women would put inside of them before they had intercourse that would have an image of Set on it, and it would represent Set, and that would prevent coming into this world. Just as at the end, he's there to escort you when you go into the other world. So that is one aspect of Set as the initiator.
Well, and there's also the association of the dryness of the desert as opposed to kind of the abundance of life near the water of the Nile.
Right. Well, that has a whole other symbolism. But there's so many aspects of Set, you could do an entire show on only that. But I think what you referred to especially, you mentioned Osiris, so let's limit it to that for this evening. It's like what Goethe writes about Mephistopheles, the force that is evil that does good. If you look at the Egyptian mythology, it looks like Set is only causing trouble, killing people, damaging things. But out of all of his apparently destructive and terrifying action, he actually is the protagonist that makes everything happen. So with Osiris, he kills Osiris, but by killing him, he shows the formula for immortal life. And this gets into a little bit like, if I'm sure you are both aware of the Gospel of Judas, where
yes,
Judas is a necessary force in the actual Christian initiatory system, in that it's required for Judas to betray Jesus for him to be reborn, which of course is not just a physical rebirth, but initiatory rebirth on a higher level. this is what Set does with Osiris. By killing him, and then he's cut into different parts, that is like a shamanic initiatory rebirth process. So Set creates immortality, and Set rapes, but creates the god of wisdom. So
that's interesting, and I'm glad I was exactly thinking of Judas. I wonder if we talked about this on one of our other episodes, but even
maybe in a past life, not in this.
True. Even in a mundane Christian way, Judas is still the one that makes it happen. Not even talking about the Gnostic versions of his story.
Right. You can look at the exoteric Christianity, and it's still quite clear that without Pontius Pilate, there's no resurrection. You could look at it that way. And
right.
that is partially, Set's a very deep subject, but that is the cosmic force that Set represents. It seems chaotic, terrible, and negative and frightening. That is the quality of Set, but it actually creates everything that is positive. It makes things happen. Without, so a little bit, I don't want to make this comparison too exactly, but sort of like Loki in his relation to the northern pantheon, nothing would happen without Loki causing the trouble he causes. And like the trickster in every single spiritual tradition, Set's seemingly chaotic, negative, destructive, or terrifying activity creates positive changes. So
it's like the forest fire that destroys a forest, and then all this new growth comes.
Exactly. That's a perfect metaphor.
So Nikolas, we've been talking about a lot of heavy topics, as we do with you, which is our favorite thing to do. But I think it might be important to also look at the role of humor in all of this. What's your perspective?
Well, what comes to mind is the Sanskrit phrase lila, which means the playfulness of the gods. And that is extremely necessary for initiates and mystics to cultivate. In fact, you shouldn't have to cultivate it. If we get back to what I was discussing, if you understand that nothing happens, that this experience, this phenomena that we have of consciousness is not even existent, that it's a dreamlike illusion, then that's hilarious, actually. That is a cosmic joke. And then we can take a very graceful, light approach to living. And actually, even though we can take it seriously on one hand, how can we possibly take it seriously on another? So that is, this quality lila is not really part of Western thinking, but it means literally the playfulness of the gods. Because the gods, the diva beings, can basically do anything, life is joyful and playful. It isn't a serious, grim, fatal process. It's a game. And I think anyone who genuinely understands the mystical experience and non-dualism understands the humor of our situation, even though it could be very grim humor. But, human life is ultimately absurd. But that I don't mean in a bitter or sarcastic way. It is joyful to see the nature of reality. So humor is a very important component in actual magical and mystical process. And even to be a good magician, let alone a transcendent, liberated initiate or adept, even to be a good magician, you have to understand it's a game. You have to look at it with the playfulness of a child and the imagination of a child to understand how magic works. So yeah, humor's absolutely essential, and Set, Loki, Tezcatlipoca, these trickster beings are humorists in many ways, even though their humor could be black humor.
Well, and what's funny is the trickster always tells the truth but is accused of being a liar.
Absolutely. Yeah, well like the court jester can say something to the king that is true, but you choose to take it as a joke. So that's the flip side of the same phenomenon. And
I can't help but thinking about the Voodoo Loa Barons Samedi.
Yeah, he
Because
is very important to me. As you may know, I had an experience with him in Haiti when I was very young. So yeah, he's a very similar being.
And he laughs a lot. And the spirits with him are often joking.
Right. Well, he's a perfect god to end on for this Halloween episode. The god of the cemetery, the lord of the graveyard. And yeah, he's joyful in the midst of death.
Well, Nikolas, as usual, thank you so much. We're always honored to have you on, and we treasure you not only as a guest but as a friend. I think that your message is very important in the era we're in, and also I have said before, I think that your voice is reaching people who might not normally be exposed to the ideas that you're sharing, and that is very important.
I really have come to believe that's part of my mission here, wherever I came here, is to reach people who normally would never be exposed to this. I think if there's any value that can come from the life I've lived, it's that. So I agree with you.
That and some great death rock.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and happy Halloween to everyone. And remember, there is nothing to fear in death because nothing happens.
Thank you, Nikolas.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was the ever-intriguing Nikolas Schreck pontificating for his Halloween Dharma teaching for all of you. We, as usual, are elated to have had him on the show again. We think he is the ideal Halloween guest. Nikolas has a certain incisive acumen where he cuts through a lot of over-intellectual terminology to really get to the heart of what's going on. And I think it's important because a lot of the things we're discussing, it's beyond Buddhism or Christianity or Egyptian religion or shamanism or magic or anything. And sometimes we need to, I think, view things from the viewpoint of ultimate reality. And what greater reality than when you die, what you go through, what you have to face, and what you experience. So for that reason, I personally am grateful for him coming on the podcast, discussing these matters. Hopefully it will give people some pause to consider their own passing, whenever that may be, and engage in the practice of memento mori.
I love that he's our reoccurring Halloween guest. It's just so cool. He's such an interesting character, and we always have so much fun talking with him, and he's always very insightful. It's always a hit with listeners when he's on the show, so I'm super grateful that he decided to come on again. We're just going to keep the tradition going as long as we can. And yeah, he is very knowledgeable about all sorts of things, and he makes it very accessible. He does cut out a lot of the more technical jargon that isn't necessarily necessary in order to actually cut to the heart of the message. So I love listening to him talk about these things. So just another great Nikolas Schreck episode.
Absolutely. And hopefully everyone will have an excellent Halloween or Walpurgisnacht or Samhain or whatever Day of the Dead, Day of All Saints, however you celebrate it. You have an entire month. The season of sex, death, and regeneration begins at the onset of Scorpio, October 21st, and concludes at the end of that period when the sun moves into Sagittarius. So you have a month, and during the next month I would recommend ancestor veneration, visiting the cemetery to see deceased loved ones, leaving out offerings, contemplating your own death, working with deities of death and regeneration or spirits of death and regeneration, and things Saturnian.
Yeah, no, this is a good time to work with those deities that live in that liminal space, like Hermes, Hecate, Anubis, this is a good time to work with them, I think. In addition to what you just said about ancestor veneration and those kind of things.
So our book this year, this Halloween season, our book review is a book called The Darkling, a treatise on Slavic vampirism by Jan L. Perkowski. This writer, while he was pursuing folklore work in Eastern Canada, he actually stumbled upon a vampire cult. And he ended up being invited to do a series of lectures, and he established a college course called Vampires of the Slavs. And so this is a monograph written in a scholarly way. However, it is accessible on the Slavic origins of the vampire myth and the development of the vampire. And it also is interesting because he compares the shift from fiction to folklore in the vampire myth to the development of the myth of St. Nicholas from the Bishop of Myra to Santa Claus. So he does this contrasting thing in one chapter. In the second chapter, he goes into the origins of the European vampire in word and concept. And then as it progresses, he also goes into the idea of daemon or spirit contamination, which is very common in early vampire literature, different kinds of demons, which might also be inspirations for the vampire myth. And then in the final chapter, he goes into an analysis of 15 Slavic folkloric vampire texts, including the transcription of an 18th century vampire trial. So it's a very interesting book. It even goes into the psychological underpinnings of vampire beliefs and the way they're transmitted among people, the role of dreams in vampirism, and then there's a multilingual biography in the back. So this is a very interesting book. If you find the subject of vampires interesting, this may be the go-to resource for that.
And the name and author once again?
The Darkling, a treatise on Slavic vampirism by Jan L. Perkowski. It is available on Amazon. It's very good. I think especially if it were read in combination with Nigel Jackson's book, The Complete Vampire, which is also a recommended resource for people who are interested in the subject of vampirism. I think that this would be some very interesting reading, but if you're subject to nightmares or a sensitivity like that, I would definitely recommend that you don't read it before you go to sleep at night. Personally, I didn't find it disturbing, but some people are more sensitive than me.
Okay, thanks for that little disclaimer. Sounds great. We definitely need to have an episode on Slavic folklore and magic at some point.
Oh yeah, it's in the works for sure. All right, so you guys can find us on Stitcher, YouTube, iTunes, Podbean, most places that podcasts are available. As always, thank you to everyone who supports this podcast, this labor of love. And again, thank you to Nikolas for so graciously sharing his time and insight and wisdom.
Yep, okay. That's very well said. I think that's all that needs to be said. We will see you all in the next episode.